Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Stuart Jordan, your host for today's ADHD Experts webinar broadcast presented by Attitude Magazine. Today's webinar is part of our annual Success at School series. Today, we will be addressing overcoming reading challenges for kids with ADHD. Research reports that 1 in 5 young students struggle with reading. Knowing the source of the reading problem and recognizing that symptoms can vary widely are both critical for planning the proper course of action. Today, we will be addressing how to develop a plan for your child and to bring pleasure to their reading process. Our guest today is Dr. Robin McEvoy, a developmental neuropsychologist practicing in Denver, Colorado. She evaluates and diagnoses a wide range of learning disabilities and learning needs in children, adolescents, and adults. This includes the identification of reading disabilities such as dyslexia. She then works with the family to develop a treatment plan to remediate the weaknesses and accentuate strengths. In addition to her private practice, Dr. McEvoy is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center, and she is the author of a children's book, Buddy, A Story for Dyslexia, and is a co-author editor of the recently published book, Child Decoded, Unlocking Complex Issues in Your Child's Learning, Behavior, and Attention. You can find out information about the book at www.childdecoded.com. And you can read more about Robin at her website, www.robinmcavoy.com, and you can follow her on Facebook. Topics that we will address today will include the accepted definition of dyslexia and some common misconceptions, common sources of reading challenges, practical and fun strategies for building reading skills, developing a back-to-school reading game plan, planning for school accommodations, the many faces of ADHD and reading challenges, and strategies for encouraging a reluctant reader by making reading fun. And I'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's Attitude webinar, Reading Buddy software. Reading Buddy is advanced speech recognition technology that listens, responds, and teaches as your child reads. It's like having a tutor in your computer. Children who use Reading Buddy software for 3 months can improve their reading skills by up to 50%. Please visit their website, www.readingbuddysoftware.com, for more information. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. McEvoy. We're glad to have your helpful guidance.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be able to do this presentation today. Let's see. Dyslexia is a reading challenge, but not all reading challenges are dyslexia. In fact, in the diagnostic manual that we use for these, for making diagnoses, dyslexia is not even in it because they just went with a broader reading disability. And dyslexia is a fairly specific reason for the reading disability. Even learning specialists, though, do not always make that distinction. And some learning specialists will just call any reading challenge or reading weakness dyslexia. And so parents will walk away being told their child has dyslexia, but actually their reading problem may be due to some other challenge. And that's really what today's going to be about. As Stuart mentioned, 1 in 5 children do struggle with reading, but not all for the same reasons. Now, 1 in 5 children, that means 20% of the class in any classroom may not be strong readers, and some will be quite weak. And so I always like to make the point that if 1 in 5 people in the population struggles with something, we actually should also see it as a type of normal, because we can't think 20% of our population is actually disabled. But be that as it may, we have to read in our society, and knowing why a child is struggling with reading will help both with the remediation and with the long-term planning. So let's see, dyslexia. This isn't about dyslexia, but I thought I'd do a quick review so you'll have a sense of the contrast between dyslexia and other reading challenges. Now, dyslexia is a reading weaknesses. weakness, and it's due to weaknesses in phonological processing. And our words that we speak are made up of little individual phonemes, little individual sounds. Let's say the word cat, short word, one syllable, but it's actually 3 phonemes, ka, a, ta. And a child with dyslexia has trouble linking those phonemes with the letters. They have trouble remembering the sounds and remembering which sounds go with which letters. So B goes with ba and D goes with da, but that just fades out really quickly for the child with dyslexia. So when they're looking at the word dog, they don't know if it's dog or bog because they can't remember what sound goes with that letter. And you take sounds like in the vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, ah, eh, eh. Those are very subtle differences, and you can see where if your brain doesn't have a sensitivity to these sounds, you can lose it very, very quickly. Then there's also phonological sequencing, and you'll hear this. It's almost like a pre-symptom, a pre-diagnostic mark for dyslexia when the child cannot remember a phonological sequence. So they see the butterfly and they say, look at the flutterby. They'll get the sequence out of order, and you'll sometimes see a sequence with words. We run heavily to dyslexia in my extended family, and so we're used to these and they're family jokes. But we had kids who didn't watch Little House on the Prairie. They watched Little Prairie on the House. And when you're a young child, you really don't know what a prairie is. So the prairie can be on the house or the house can be on the prairie. It makes no difference to you. But those sorts of sequential errors. And as someone gets older, they may struggle like that the word is relevant, but they may say relevant. They can't remember the sequence of those phonemes. This is a neurological issue in origin. There's nothing that happened to cause it in their environmental experiences. It was going to be weak from the start. And it has a genetic component. If there is a parent with dyslexia, there's a 50-50 chance that any child in the family will have dyslexia. The common misconceptions is that this is a visual processing problem, usually because this child will confuse B and D and other letters and think, wow, they can't see the difference between B and D. And it's not that they can't see the difference. They just can't remember which letter goes with which sound. So they're often just taking a wild guess on that. Another misconception is you'll grow out of dyslexia, that it's a problem with childhood or a problem with school, but really you can get good remediation and reading can improve, but you will always have some markers of it, and it will often stay a relative weakness to other skills. Common misconception with any learning disability also is that it's associated with intelligence. And we certainly have gifted people who can have dyslexia, but certainly it's not associated with intelligence. And it's so important to get good remediation, because you don't feel smart though if you can't do something that most of the population seems to do more easily. A little aside, I think this is kind of important, that learning disabilities are actually fairly culturally specific very often. Some developmental disabilities are not. When a child can't learn to speak, it's going to have a broad impact in most cultures. But say a reading disability is a bit culturally specific. You can't be reading disabled in a society that doesn't require reading. Think of a fishing village in Africa where no one reads. You're not going to be reading disabled. On the other hand, if you can't learn to fish, you're fishing disabled. And here in our culture, we require reading for a lot of our learning, and it's a very important skill for being successful as an adult. But I do remind parents that if we needed to sing to graduate, a lot of us would be diagnosed with singing disabilities, and we would have singing remediation and special ed teachers for our singing skills. So we have to remember that we're dealing with a culturally specific problem. And this is actually what inspired me to write the children's book, Buddy, A Story for Dyslexia, which is basically about a little bird who can't sing, and what do you do about it? And so it mimics the challenges of dyslexia, and it's for children to help them understand kind of what they're going through and what to do about it. That being said, we have to help weak readers. So there are other sources of reading challenges outside of dyslexia, which is a phonological processing problem. And some of those can be language processing weaknesses, impaired auditory processing, executive function weaknesses, visual processing problems, and then some other challenges. And we're going to go into some more detail with each one of these. So language processing and the impact on reading. Now, there's two main language domains: receptive language weaknesses and expressive language weaknesses. Receptive language weaknesses are when the child cannot receive language easily. They don't understand what's being said to them easily. And this can impact reading, because when they learn to read, they can't understand. They have to sort out those words too, and they can make reading go very slowly as they struggle to make sense of the words and the message within those words. Expressive language weaknesses is when the child cannot express himself easily. So he actually understands everything that's said to him, but when he goes to express himself, to communicate, he has a hard time pulling together the words, the complexity of the words. Sometimes I'll see children who talk a lot, but you realize none of their sentences is maybe more than 5 words long. And that's sort of a marker that we're having trouble with expressive language. And complicated things like if-thens and what-ifs, those things that require some explanation, they have a very hard time with. If a child has a language disability, odds are high that they're going to be a slow starter for reading. And sometimes no one spots the language disability until the child fails to learn to read. So everybody's thinking it's a reading problem. But when you do an in-depth evaluation, you say, language is weak in this child. And really the problem starts with a language disability. We tend to monitor reading in school more closely than language. We sort of assuming language is in place. And since we have larger classrooms and we actually don't want the children talking all the time during class, you may not spot that this is starting with a language problem. And then a little about speech versus language. Most of the time we talk about speech therapists, but really they're speech and language therapists, and they are different, and they have a different impact on reading as well. But language is about taking meaning and giving meaning from words, but speech is about making the actual words. So stuttering is a speech disability. Articulation disorders are speech disorders, not language disorders. So the child who can't make an S sound, or can't make a th sound, or can't do the velars, the g and the k, they can't get their tongue in their mouth and their lips to work together to make the sounds well. These can also be called speech apraxia or oral motor apraxia. The researchers expected speech disorders to be a little more closely linked to reading disorders. I mean, can you learn to sound out words if you can't make all the sounds? But the research did not hold up quite as strong as they expected. They were a little surprised that kids with speech disorders often did not have the expected weaknesses in reading disabilities. But you do need to watch it carefully, and I do think it can slow down reading when you're having trouble making all those sounds. So when a reading problem starts in a speech or language disorder, then the remediation is best done with a speech and language specialist who knows reading remediation. If you just start with reading, how is the child supposed to use that information if they're weak with language? And I did have a language specialist once say to me, why teach her to read if there's no language bank to put the words in? So you really have to start down at the speech language level. Make sure as this child learns to read, they have a language bank that can take in the information. So that order of intervention is really important. And so you want to make sure that you understand if language is the source of the problem, you really need to have a intervention that understands the language disability, and that you have a language therapist who can work from there to build language and reading skills at the same time. So impaired auditory processing. This one's actually pretty similar to dyslexia, but somewhat different. Auditory processing will also impact language processing. You take a child with dyslexia, and they actually pretty much always understand what's said to them. But you take a child with auditory processing problems, and they will have trouble with the phonemes in the reading, but also in the spoken language. And so, for example, you may say last night's rain, and this is heard as last night's train. Or you say the red box, and it's heard as the red box. And so you can imagine the confusion. It makes it hard to discriminate sounds and words, both for speech and reading. And the remediation can be similar, and we'll be talking about that a little later. But the child also needs support for listening in the classroom, because they're going to misunderstand directions. You see this in kids who are identified with attention deficit disorder. But sometimes I'll see a child identified with attention deficit disorder, and as I'm picking it apart, it's like, this is an auditory processing problem, or at least is a big part of it. For this child, paying attention doesn't help. When they pay attention, they still have not fully understood what was said to them, and so therefore, after a while, they just stop paying attention. And so once again, you have to start at the source of the problem and build up from there. How does this happen? How do you get auditory processing problems? Occasionally, I'll see them running in families. A common thing is when I have a history of fluid in the ears in the first year of life, that this child was very prone to ear infections or just very prone to fluid in the ears. And you are laying down your wiring for discrimination of sounds in the first year or two of life. So very important work being done by the brain to understand what language it'll be hearing, what are the sounds in those language, and learning to discriminate those sounds. Even when they get older or the ears clear up, you can still have some permanent miswiring for sounds. One year I had 3 9-year-olds come in separately, all unrelated, but all had a history of early fluid in the ears. 2 came out of orphanages and developing countries, so very untreated, and none of them could discriminate ma from pa. And you think about ma and pa, and you do your lips actions for them, and they are actually virtually identical. And they could not hear the difference between ma and pa because they had not laid down good wiring for that. And so, of course, that's going to impact reading. And you're going to be remediating that through one of the multisensory reading programs. Let's see if, there we go, executive function weaknesses. This is a little bit different. Now, executive function challenges include weaknesses in sequencing, patterning, and organizing. They're very common in kids with attention deficit disorder. Sometimes I see kids, their entire problems with attention actually come from executive function weaknesses. They actually have good basic attention, but they aren't good at organizing and planning and sequencing. And so they're always kind of going off in the wrong direction, and people think they lost their attention, but really they just lost their way with the task. Executive function weaknesses do impact early reading because the phonics patterns are initially difficult to detect. You take a pattern like bat, cat, mat, rat. We hear that pattern. We hear the AT pattern with different consonants on the front, but you give a 6-year-old who's not organized and he sees mat, bat, cat. He actually may not see the relationship between those words. And so they don't detect these early patterns. And then you have to also realize how complicated reading is. We have 26 letters. Some of the vowels, like A, makes up to 5 different sounds depending on how it's used in the word and how it's paired with other letters. You take SH, TH, CH. You just take one letter, give it an H, and it makes a new sound. There's a lot to keep track of. And a child with executive function weaknesses may have a terrible time settling into reading. On the bright side, early reading problems remediate fairly quickly with an organized reading program. They move along faster than kids with dyslexia because they can hear the sounds, and a good reading program really lays out the patterns for them, and they can make progress a little more easily. On the not so bright side, if you have a child with executive function weaknesses, there can be later reading challenges due to problems with tracking plot, tracking characters, tracking the information, not losing track of little specific parts of directions. So what started as a problem that looked a little dyslexic because they could not remember the sounds and the sound patterns, later on becomes a problem with organization of the material they've read. So you're going to support differently at different ages. Visual processing problems. Reading is largely, a visual process as well as a language process. You have different tasks for the eyes to do. Convergence. Can the eyes focus on the page? Can the eyes team? And work together. You have a kid who's got a weaker eye and the eyes cannot scan together. So, of course, that's going to make reading very difficult. You have other scanning issues where the scanning is not smooth. The eyes cannot just simply move easily across the page. You have trouble discriminating sizes and shapes. There's a lot of visual components to reading, and there's ways that can can go awry and make reading difficult. I've had kids come in. I don't often spot my visual processing problems in test scores as much as I spot it in what they're doing to try to compensate. I've seen kids whose eyes turn red and bloodshot while they read. I had one young man who once, because it's only happened this one time, but it was immediately had me question. I put the reading in front of him. It's propped up on a board, so it's, he doesn't have to lean over. But as soon as I put it in front of him, he leaned back several inches. So he's now about 15 inches from the text. And I said, "Why did you lean back?" He said, "Because if I get too close and my eyes have to go back and forth, I'll get a headache." But if he leaned back, his eyes did not have to scan. He could get the whole line of text in his line of vision without having to scan. Those are things I think, we may have to go see what a developmental optometrist will do about that. So what do you do? Sometimes glasses for convergence or near point will take care of that issue fairly quickly. Sometimes you would go to occupational therapy, sort of a sensory processing therapy, to organize some deeper systems as well as some of the higher systems. The vestibular system, which is a deep system, is very linked to the visual system, or the visual system is linked to it. So if your vestibular system's out of whack, your visual system will not work as well. So sometimes you'll organize some deeper systems, and then we'll organize some of the higher systems. Or the vision therapy is to specifically practice different types of convergence and scanning and eye teaming. And these are important things to kind of try to keep track of. Children with visual issues take their visual issues as a given, and they don't often mention the problem. Was talking with a parent once who said a very good OT was putting some reading in front of her son, who was quite gifted, but not settling into reading at all. And she finally said, "What are you waiting for?" Because he wasn't reading it. He says, "I'm waiting for the letters to sit still." And that no one had thought to ask that question. Why aren't you starting to read this? And he's like, the letters are moving on the page for him. So they started some sensory work and worked through the visual systems and got things up and running. Other reading challenges. Certainly kids with attention deficit disorder can be slow to learn to read. As I said, it's a complex, process, and in their young children, and organizing all of it can be hard, and keeping their attention to it. On the bright side, I'll see a lot of kids with attention issues, and I say, this little person may not like learning to read, but I think they'll like being a reader, because often these children are very curious. They really enjoy knowledge. They enjoy information. And really, for those of us who have worked with early reading material, sometimes it's not very interesting to try to read the cat sat on the mat. That doesn't engage a curious and inattentive mind. So I often recommend that they work with a reading specialist to push them through early reading as quickly as possible, so they get the patterns in, and this child may enjoy being a reader much more than they enjoy learning to read. Slow processing speed. Slow processing speed can occur for a number of reasons, but it keeps them reading slowly. It could be just that there's some other subtle learning challenges. It could be some subtle language issues, but still, slow processing speed. Often we want to tutor up the reading a little bit to make it as strong as possible, and then we accommodate it. Complex learning disabilities. You have kids come in who struggle with math, they struggle with writing, they struggle with reading, they struggle with executive function. You'll see good markers for intelligence in there, but very hard for them to apply it in a lot of situations. Everything is a struggle for these kids, including reading. And you end up supporting reading, and you give it a little bit of priority because reading touches on so many classes. Concussions. If you have a child who has any sort of challenge, learning, attention, reading challenge, and there's a concussion, even if you've done some good remediation, even if you think you've gotten through the tough stuff and you're muddling along a little more easily now, a concussion will exacerbate some pre-existing issues, and sometimes just mimic them. A child who did not have pre-existing issues now has headaches, or now isn't sleeping well, or fatigues more easily. Depending on the nature of the concussion, they're having neck pain or something because it was a whiplash type injury. You have to watch concussions and know when you have a concussion, you want the child to recover. And some of the headachy, some of the milder stuff will resolve in a few days, but you might see some impact on learning for several months. And certainly for kids in school, you will see impact on learning. They may have a gap, that right after the concussion, they weren't available for learning and they have gaps in some knowledge, and you have to go back and fill in those gaps after they've recovered. And then you get some other weird stuff. I don't think of reading as particularly related to allergies or to different things, some of the complementary alternative stuff, which I think is really important for so many other challenges. But I was talking with a colleague once, a nurse actually, and she was saying her daughter had been diagnosed with a reading disability, and it had been a struggle, and they had done all sorts of intervention. And then in high school, she started having more and more gut issues to the point where she couldn't get to school. And finally, someone diagnosed celiac disease. Just, man, once she came off of gluten, she could just read. So she loved reading after that. So there are things going on that could be deeper issues that you should keep track of, and know that they can have an impact on reading. Alrighty, strategies for building reading skills over the summer, because we are still in summer, though it's fast getting towards the end. Some of the best tutoring programs are the multisensory reading programs. Orton Gillingham, Slingerland, Barton, Wilson, Lindemood Bell. There's this number of really good multisensory reading programs. And multisensory means they are backing up the phonological processing with motor and visual cues. So back to our B and D example. They will say, ba, ba, ba. Ba goes with B. Let's look in the mirror. Ba, ba, ba. Do you see your lips pop? It's a lip popper. Ba is. But da, da. Da goes with D. Da is a tongue tapper. You feel it tap on the back of your teeth, and they're going to separate all of the sounds by their motor cue and their visual cue. And then they also have multisensory ways of teaching the sequencing. And these have been the best for dyslexic children, but they also are really good organized programs. And so they can be good for so many reading challenges. So, don't think, well, if he's not dyslexic, it won't help. Those are often very helpful. Now, other programs, there's the commercial reading programs, the commercial tutoring programs like Sylvan and Huntington. Those are pretty good, but they're not multisensory. And it can be okay for some of the non-dyslexic kids and the non-auditory kids, but be aware that the multisensories are considered to be a bit stronger. And so going off to do private tutoring programs, a multisensory program might be your best direction. But the Sylvan and a lot of those other programs are pretty decent programs. The Davis Dyslexia program has been around for a while now, and I see it as a really good example of when the dyslexia term got used inappropriately. Ron Davis was diagnosed with dyslexia when he was young, and I was reading his description of his diagnosis in his book and said, oh man, that's not dyslexia, but somebody called it that. So he grew up thinking he was dyslexic. He later identified as having autism, and but he developed this program that he felt really worked for him, and it's been out there ever since, and I do see it working for some people. It's multisensory in its own way. I do think it largely depends on the quality of the tutor doing it. And if it didn't work for anybody, it would die out. Yeah. And then you have just general tutoring programs. A good, strong teacher can make a lot of headway over the summer. So, keep those in mind. But once again, the multisensory programs are considered the strongest. Sort of do-it-yourself stuff, reading programs for purchase or for training. Barton, which is a multisensory reading program, occasionally I've seen parts of the country where they will train parents. And then there's things like Explode the Code, been around for a long time for breaking out phonological processing and reading. And Hooked on Phonics, it's a nice little program, but it's phonics-based, but it's not multisensory. So if you think your child has trouble with phonology, it may not be the best program. It'll help a little, but you'll realize, man, they still can't remember ah from ah. So they're still misreading egg and bat and things like that. And then there's other programs as I was looking at who was sponsoring us. There's new things coming out like the Reading Buddy software. These are all things you can look into and explore and say, I think this would help. You may need a private tutor who does one of the stronger programs. If you're very delayed in reading, I would highly recommend it. But these are going to be helpful and give you some structure at home. And then family reading time. There's valuing reading as an important way to spend your time. If a parent is not stopping to read, you aren't showing value for the skill. And so making a family reading time over the summer, a couple of times a week, where everybody sits down and reads. And reading can be defined loosely for weak readers, but finding a way to do those things. And we'll talk about that in a bit for encouraging weak or reluctant readers. Let's see, plans for the new school year. So you've done a little work over the summer. You want to hit the school year strong. Start strong. If your child has a history of reading weakness, your child has a history of any other challenge, if you have a strong family history of dyslexia, schools may say, well, let's take a wait and see approach. But I think parents often know their kids well, and they should. I mean, they're certainly going to know them better than a new teacher. And so I think they're allowed to say, no. We have a strong history, and I think we're going to have problems, and I'd like to start strong, at least with the RTI, a response to intervention plan. But if he's like, I want to sign the paperwork for evaluation, you'll know if your child's going into kindergarten and still can't recognize his letters, this wasn't a problem 50 years ago, and it's a problem now. You go into kindergarten to learn to read, and you're going to have all your foundation in place. So if they don't recognize the letters, you're going to be behind. So you might as well say, we are not ready, and you better start now. Finding the source of the reading problem if you can. Once again, is it dyslexia? Does it run in your family? Do you have a strong history of that? Is it auditory processing? You realize your child misses a lot of other directions and confuses sounds. Is it attention issues? Is it organizational? Some districts can do an in-depth evaluation. I think can find that better than others. And sometimes you should go out privately. Ask for remediation with the multisensory reading programs. They are systematic, they are sequential, they are done with fidelity. We say they should be done with fidelity. That's another thing to ask. Do you use a multisensory program? That's like, oh yes, we have Orton Gillingham trained special ed teacher. Does she use the whole program? Is she using it systematically, sequentially, done with fidelity? It's like, oh no, we just pick and choose the parts we found most helpful. Take that with caution and say, all right, we're going to have to watch this closely, because if you feel like your child's really going to struggle with reading, we have to have a very systematic intervention. You may not get it with using just the best of a program. You may have to do the whole thing. So remediation, we're trying to get in place, and then we want to ask for accommodations. Oral directions repeated to them. They're not going to work with written directions well. We're not expecting this in kindergarten or first grade, but by third, fourth, fifth grade, people are writing directions down. That's a great help if you can read. And so we need to make sure we have those modifications in place. Modified testing is needed. Certainly give them extra time if they're a slow reader, but sometimes we need a different format. And I commonly will ask for oral retesting if a score is poor to ensure that their grade reflects their knowledge, not a problem with the test format. Audiobooks. I always remind people there's nothing magical about reading to learn. We read to learn because we invented a printing press 900 years ago. And before that, we did not read to learn. Books were very rare. We did things through lecture, through hands-on experiences. But we've gotten very addicted to books, and I love books, but they're not the magical marker for learning. So use technology and use it heavily. And then if your child is struggling with reading, they're often going to have even more struggle with writing. So make sure you've thought through some writing accommodations. And that will, of course, vary by grade. Now, there are many different phases of ADHD, and there's many different types of reading challenges, as we've discussed. Attention problems or reading problems can be just the tip of the iceberg. A child who can't pay attention or a child who's struggling at reading, those can be the symptom of something a little bit deeper. Sometimes you have to go into the deeper waters. Where's our language? Where's our auditory problem? Where's our auditory processing? Where's our organization? Sometimes you have to go a little deeper to find the causes, because sometimes you may find more than one. In shameless endorsement mode here, we actually wrote a book about this, the Child Decoded book, because sometimes just working at the top wasn't working. We're doing reading remediation, but we're not seeing the progress we want to see. We're doing medication for attention, but we're still having issues. We decided we needed something to help parents dig a little deeper, and that's what that book is about. There can be just so many contributing factors to some things. All right, strategies for encouraging the reluctant reader. I know these so personally because I had a reluctant reader. And I love reading, so it was such a bummer. But it was good for professional skill development. Comic books, graphic novels, they feel very age appropriate. They have a lot of picture support. They don't have a lot of text. I always remind people that reading for pleasure is reading for pleasure. Don't give your child something they're not going to enjoy just because you think they should. Dig around, find topics they like, and find things that make the reading feel manageable. Magazines and material with strong picture support, National Geographic for kids, Time Magazine for kids, or say you have a child who loves surfing or loves fashion or loves skateboarding. You can get great magazines that have stunning pictures that are going to be so compelling. And if you get a child interested enough, they're going to want to read a little bit about it. And so you're doing these what I consider to be stealth approaches. You're having things in the house that really draw them in and see if it will lead them down the path to reading more about it. Have a child read to a younger child. This allows them to read simpler text in a way that doesn't feel immature for them, that they're actually supporting someone else. And that, of course, you need a child who wants to read to a younger child, but some kids really enjoy that. They love the nurturing aspects and they love the leadership aspect of it. Watching a movie before the book. A lot of readers will struggle with the decoding, and since it's a struggle, no movie is forming in their head while they read because they're working too much on the decoding process, or they have too much executive function weakness to keep track. But the movie will give them a lot of visual imagery to pull up, and that will help them, therefore, make it through the book. They have a movie form more easily. And then continue reading to the reluctant reader. I had a speech language and reading specialist years ago say, I read to my boys all the way into middle school. It keeps you into text that they may not tackle themselves. And if they find it compelling, they may try to tackle it themselves. And then don't force the reading. Try these stealth approaches. Confessions of a mother here. When my child was in the early grades and you had the reading log and they were supposed to read 20 minutes a night, you had to sign off on it. And I knew if I made mine go do your reading. And she was a very reluctant reader. Reading would be a chore. Reading would be work. Reading would be something they make you do. And I did not want that. So I just read to her and I put her in charge of something. It's like we'd be reading Harry Potter when she's 8 or 9. I said, I'm putting you in charge of Dobby. You're going to read Dobby's words. And Dobby, was a funny character, and he's a little repetitive in his speech patterns. And my child, when she was resisting reading, could sound a lot like Dobby anyway. So it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. But these stealth approaches, I think, will get you a child who doesn't resist the reading as much. And by 5th grade, I had a child who read comic books and enjoyed college-level material about space travel and like the relationship between computers and man and the trip to the moon. Yeah, and so I don't know, she's just an odd reader, but she reads, and so it worked. So in closing, reading is important, but it's not more important than your child's happiness. Go slow, go stealthy as needed, and know that there's lots of other ways to get through learning. There are amazing surgeons, business people, novelists, athletes, actors who had reading disabilities. They often give a lot of credit to this reading challenge and helping them find innovative approaches to life. They feel like the reading challenge really helped them find new ways to approach the world and made them quite successful. And then lastly, use technology. As that printing press, it made us a reading world, but it's not the only way to learn. And as much as I like books, I love books, I know we don't have to rely on them for our learning anymore. We have much more technology. So anyway, that's what I have to say. If there's any good questions, let me know.
Great, Robin. Thank you. Really interesting. And we have a whole list of questions here and like to try and get through what we can. Before I get to the questions, I would like to just mention that there was a lot of positive response to your comment about comparing it to the singing problem. if there was a
Oh,
singing
it gets
problem.
a good laugh, but it's so true.
But one of the questions was, besides just being something to use in a presentation, is this something that you use with the children in terms of trying to explain and put a positive spin on the situation to make it to keep them from getting too down with the fact that they have a problem?
Oh yeah, I do a lot. Whenever I evaluate, we always leave the session with saying, these are where your natural strengths are. I see you being so good at this. You must love that. You're one of those Lego people, aren't you? Because look at the way you can work visually. We really want to accentuate their strengths and say, yeah, and there's things that are not so easy for people. What do you think is a challenge for you? What do they recognize? Yeah, that's normal. And really normalize it as much as possible. No, we can't all be good at everything. And I said, I ended up writing a children's book about this called Buddy, A Story for Dyslexia, around that singing issue with a little bird. And he does a multisensory singing program to help. And so that kids have something to give them some perspective about things. This little guy was good at everything, but he couldn't sing. But singing something that's important in his community. And so therefore, he had to do some special stuff to get around it.
Okay. Variety of questions here, but let's start at the beginning, which is there are a number of questions about identifying the problem and where to go. Should you be looking to start with the pediatrician or with the school? What's the best path to try and figure out what's going on?
I think a lot of times pediatricians can be a big help if they know their community and they know their resources. Like, we like this reading specialist, or we like this diagnostician, and they're not sometimes as constrained as the school system is. School system has to provide a free, appropriate public education, and they have to provide the testing, but they aren't always allowed to refer you out. Like, this is a little more than we recognize here, unless they think the problem is medical, because a medical problem is then not an educational problem. So I think you might have a little more luck with the pediatrician if this is something the pediatric group does a lot of, that they're a very comprehensive place. It's like, oh yeah, here's where we refer our people for reading. I do, when I'm talking to families who call like from the pediatrician saying my child's got a reading problem, I lay out two options. If this is just a reading problem, that this child is slow with reading but has lots of friends, there's no attention concerns, the math is going fine, the other grades are good, it's just reading, I will then refer them to our reading specialist in our clinic, who's actually a speech language and reading specialist. And they can, start small, it's a little less expensive, gives you more money to put towards your tutoring and intervention if that's what you need, and they will send it back to me if they see a larger problem. Now, if we see reading's weak and we also can spot some other weaknesses, then we might stick with me, who's going to do a much broader evaluation. And then I said, for parents who are wondering, this is a big question, and it's so hard. It really sucks your confidence looking for someone to help you with identifying the problem. Quite frankly, that's why we wrote the book Child Decoded, because we end each chapter as, who is a qualified provider and evaluator? What is the credentialing they should need? What are the questions you can ask of them to make sure you're heading in the right direction? Because it's hard, and and it can differ from challenge to challenge. So I did try to address that in more depth, and I'm more than willing to try to address it. And follow-up questions over the next few days. But if you're looking for something that will just go at all of it, I would take a look at the book.
Okay. And following up on that, there was a comment, what do you do when the school doesn't really seem to get it or be strong in this area? How do you approach the school when they don't seem to really be that expert on the problem?
That sometimes it's good to get an advocate in, because they will know your legal options in that area, and that like we're in your community a little bit better, and they'll know their district a little bit better. But if you don't feel like they fully recognize the problem. Either they've evaluated and say, we don't see it as strong enough a problem, or they've evaluated, they're intervening, but you're not seeing enough progress. So it becomes apparent they don't quite understand the problem. You can then ask for an independent educational evaluation. It's in your legal rights that they hand you at the beginning of any meeting. And one of those is a right to request an independent evaluation at the district's expense. And so if you feel like your child's not making appropriate progress, you can ask for that support, and that independent person, they have to be qualified to do the evaluation. The district has certain qualifying standards, which are usually appropriate, licensed and experienced, but they aren't actually allowed to pick the person. You have a lot of choice in picking who you feel comfortable working with, who you think can help you sort it out.
Okay. Interesting question. Is there any hope for bilingualism when you have a child that has some of these reading and language challenges? And I guess
Yes.
and I guess the other question is, if you have a problem in one language, does it carry through to others, or can it be basically a second language actually be a source of solution?
No, the second language won't be a source of solution. So there's a couple of things in there. When you have trouble with phonology, you can have trouble learning a second language because you can't remember all the sounds in the new language very easily at all. And mostly in our society, when we are teaching a language, we usually start that in adolescence. Now, you take a child from infancy and you're raising them in a bilingual home. Even if they're going to be dyslexic, they're often going to be bilingual because the brain is in a different place in those first 5 years for acquiring language. It's a little bit different. And so, yes, you can have a bilingual child, but only if you start in infancy. If you're going to start it later than that, it's going to be a challenge. And if you start it in adolescence, it's going to be truly a challenge. The brain is shifted by them. Kids who try to learn, kids who immigrate, like to the United States, a family immigrates. The children who are pre-adolescent can learn to speak English without an accent. The kids who are post-adolescents, if you're past puberty, you'll always have an accent. The brain is shifted in its ability to do that degree of phonological work. So you won't be bilingual. It's very hard to be bilingual. I'd say you won't. You got to put a heck of a lot of effort into it. If you're dyslexic and you're learning a language late. And then, yes, you can be dyslexic in different languages, particularly if the language is phonological. They were thinking if you're reading Chinese pinyin, since it's a visual language, for a reading language, you wouldn't be dyslexic. But even then, they're sort of you have to link sound with symbol again, and you're going to still probably run into some issues. But it's different when you go to languages that are not phonetic in the reading component. English and I think French are some of the more difficult languages for dyslexics because there's so many rule breakers in our phonics of our languages.
Okay. Woman writes that her daughter is an excellent writer, but she doesn't like to read. Should she be concerned that she has some kind of dyslexia?
Oh, I have one of those children. Mine would rather write than read too, and she does a good bit of writing, and she reads according to what she likes to write, and it still doesn't read as much as I'd like. She likes writing screenplays, so she actually reads screenplays. Listen to her read, and if it's stumbly and slow and arduous, then we suspect a reading disability. If she reads fairly smoothly, then do we just have a more creative person who would rather produce than read what other people produce? I mean, mine looked up at me when she was around 5 years old. I was reading a book to her, and she actually looked at me and said, "Why am I not published yet?" I'm like, really? And so there's some kids who their diagnosis is horse of a different color. And but you should look at it. Is reading arduous for them? And usually, though, if reading is arduous, writing can be, unless they're writing on the computer and they're letting the computer do a lot of the writing for them through voice recognition or through spell check, and it's not, the spelling isn't quite an issue for them. And if they like to read what they wrote, then that's something.
There's another question that just popped up where Tracy asks that her child's school requires a language, and she's asking whether, in her specific case, she's saying if she has to choose between Mandarin and Spanish, is one going to be easier than the other? And I guess the question is, given the concern, are there certain types of languages that might be easier to attack than others?
Yeah, that's a good question. Traditionally, if this child is dyslexic, or if there's a strong language processing problem, one, you can look to get an alternative to a spoken language for learning. Like at the college level, you can take sign language or another cultural immersion like Spanish art history or French cooking. In a lower grade, do you ask for an exemption and put your time elsewhere? But then if you are going to learn a language, traditionally, between Spanish and Mandarin, I'd probably pick Spanish because the sounds in the word, there's some rules for it, but they show up in the word. They're easier than French or English, actually, because the rules hold steadier for Spanish. So if you're going to pick it apart, you can use the visual cue. Mandarin, you don't have any way of breaking down the word phonologically, so you're just remembering really difficult words. And then Mandarin has a tonal component to it. So the word like ma has 4 different tones you can apply to it, and then it has 4 different meanings. And if you have trouble with phonology, you are just up a creek there with is it ma? Is it ma? Is ma? As someone who's tried both the languages and as someone who has trouble with that type of phonology, I can say, go with the Spanish before the Mandarin, or before the Mandarin.
Okay, we're starting to run short on time, but there's one topic that has come up numerous times in the questions here, and it has to do with older children in high school and getting ready to college age. And it has to do with the ability, with the speed of reading and comprehension, and what to do when you've got a child who is a decent to good student, but is slow. How can you basically help them? Because the fear, the thread running through all these questions is the fear that that the speed of reading is going to hold them back and get in the way of their being able to succeed in school.
Well, I think using the books on tape, using the talking book libraries, using those for at least some of your reading, with the advances in technology, so many people now can access. It used to be the library for the blind, and now then it became the library for the blind and dyslexic. Now it's just Reading Ally. If you got a reading challenge, we can get that book on tape for you, including a lot of college level text. So you can go to that resource to keep the reading moving along a little more quickly. You can work with your college counselor to make sure you don't take too many heavy reading courses in one semester, that you think about your 4-year plan and you space those heavy reading courses out. You use audiobooks, you get extended time for testing or other modifications as needed. And you may have to do some evaluation. I do a lot of that testing. I do a lot of that testing for kids going off to college to make sure they have qualified not only for accommodations for the college board exams, but also at the college level that they can go to college with a 504 plan that documents their needs and then helps them access the resources.
Okay. One quick last question that just popped up, which I think is interesting, is if you have a child who is a reluctant reader, does encouraging them to read on the internet as opposed to a book with the printed page, is that a way to possibly get around the problem?
I think it's always something to try. They are finding that electronic readers and reading off the internet, actually reading is done by the brain differently than it does for paper, like book reading out of a paper book. And so I like to continue supporting both because we really don't know the long-term impact of that. But sometimes reading is reading. I do say limit some technology during like family reading time because it's so easy when you're reading off the internet to blip over to something else and watch a little YouTube. I'm not opposed to YouTube. I think it's a great resource if you're not a good reader for looking up information. But on the other hand, if we're trying to still encourage a little bit of reading, be careful of the internet.
Okay. We're running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap it up at this point. Thank you, Robin. This has been great. People really responded well to it. And also a big thank you to our sponsor, Reading Buddy Software. Please remember to visit their website, www.readingbuddysoftware.com. So thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you again, Robin, for today's presentation. We enjoyed it. And everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.